It's my great pleasure to be with you virtually. I would much rather be there in person, but this is, I guess, the next best thing under the circumstances. And I'm very glad to have a chance to try to present a number of issues and ideas that I hope we'll have some time to really discuss together and for you to relate them to your own contexts of work and the questions that occupy you. As will become clear when I talk more about the idea of indigeneity, we're at a moment in Canada of a process of reconciliation that aims to recognize the quite profound historical wrongs that have existed in the settler society. And one small part of that process is nowadays to often try to begin with a land acknowledgement. So although we're meeting in virtual space, I'm coming to you from Montreal, Canada, and from McGill University, which is located on land, unceded land that was traditionally a site of meeting of different First Nations people, particularly the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. And those peoples are very important active contributors to the fabric of Canadian society at this time. And as you'll hear, really present to us both a moral imperative and a rich set of ideas for rethinking human psychology and our efforts to promote mental health and well-being, both locally and globally. What I'm going to try to do in the next hour is touch on a series of issues that have to do with the place of culture in psychology and psychiatry, and the particular role that Indigenous psychologies and methodologies play. And I'll try to address that through the notion of cultural concepts of the person and have something to say about different ethical and methodological stances. Perhaps I should say a word about where I'm coming from, aside from my geographic location in the world. The program that I direct at McGill, which is called the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry, is the oldest academic program devoted to questions of culture and mental health in the world. It started in 1956, driven by the concerns of people who are coming from other places, particularly former British Commonwealth countries, coming to McGill for training in psychiatry, who raised questions about how applicable the models and the language and the conceptual frameworks that they were being exposed to actually were in the very diverse context that they worked in East Asia and Southeast Asia, in Africa, in South America, and so on. And that led to an effort to treat that question of cultural diversity, not just as a problem of knowledge translation. How do we take practices developed in the global north or west and translate them to other parts of the world, but rather as a way of interrogating our concepts and our practices, of engaging in dialogue and mutual reflection with people located in different parts of the world, deeply knowledgeable about particular cultural traditions and ways of life, and to create a space in which people can reflect on the impact that cultural diversity has on human experience in both health and illness. And the program started as a partnership between anthropology and psychiatry. So although we're meeting today in the context of a discipline of psychology, it's important to recognize at the outset that the questions that we're all interested in are inherently interdisciplinary, that they require all the social sciences, they require philosophical reflection, they require really any tool that we can bring and any framework that we can bring to begin to think outside the box and to generate new concepts that can be bridging concepts and that can help us think about the human condition. So the central issue for all of us in these questions is the role of culture and all the things that that word stands for in human experience and in the specific questions that concern psychology and psychiatry. And the hope is that by being attentive to cultural difference and making systematic comparisons or delving more deeply into the cultural embedding and construction of experience, we will really gain insights into how human beings function. And this can be applied not only to everyday matters of processes like child development or education or building civil society, learning to live together with diversity and so on. Very basic and crucial questions for our time, including the questions that have already been alluded to in terms of the impact of climate change and so on, which speaks right away to the human capacity to think long-term and plan long-term. I should say the capacity is sometimes a lack of capacity, but in any event, the urgency of trying to cultivate that. But also focusing on questions, in my own case, that are at the intersection of psychology and psychiatry and other mental health disciplines, where we're particularly concerned with certain kinds of problems that happen to people that involve, in some cases, their brains, but also the ways that they think and the ways that they live in families and communities, and that we need ways of putting together those different facets of human experience to make sense of the kinds of problems people get into and of the kinds of solutions, the kinds of healing, the kinds of transformations that people can engage in. All of this, of course, occurs in different societies where there is what we could already call a politics of identity and a politics of alterity. That is, a politics that designates some people as different, as other, as different from the mainstream in some ways, as having a notable culture or background. But of course, we all are cultural beings, even those of us who belong in the particular place where we live to the dominant cultural frame. In which case, because we're part of that dominant frame, we may have the illusion at times that we're not distinctively cultural. When I walk out on the street in Montreal, I can sometimes think, well, I'm just doing things the way they're supposed to be done here. But when I talk to you, it's quite evident to you that I speak a particular kind of English and that I'm going to use examples that are exotic and colorful because they come from my own backyard. For me, they're ordinary. And it's that way for all of us. We all sort of take our own cultural context for granted until we travel, until we meet people who are different. And it's the other, the designated other, the person who's labeled by society or by some institutions as different in some way, who then bears that label of culture or ethnicity or racialized identity and so on, for better or for worse. So we want to take a step back from that and acknowledge that even when we don't notice it, cultural histories, cultural learnings, cultural ways of living are in play and are necessary, in fact, for all of us to develop and function. So the broadest view of culture then is not as ethnicity, not as a label that gets attached to somebody who's different from whatever the local norm is, but as the social matrix of human life, of human development. We have for 50,000 years or more been living in culturally constructed worlds. We are all adapting to environments that we ourselves, our communities, have constructed. And that make certain kinds of adaptive demands on us. So we want to make sense of that, make sense of how that works to allow us to realize our potentials, to learn a language, to learn skills, to build relationships, to have a meaningful life, and how that can go wrong when we're unable to meet some of the challenges or address some of the predicaments that society creates for us. So this is the broad view of culture, and this broad view of culture would include even the technical practices we have, like psychology or psychiatry or other academic disciplines that present themselves as bodies of scientific knowledge, but that also always have a history, come from a certain direction, have posed certain questions because of where they're coming from and what that history is. Given that broad view of culture and the idea that culture is constructing the context that we live in, it's important to recognize that whatever we might mean by culture is also constantly changing. And we are living life now on a planetary scale. We're connected to each other through electronic media and through mass migration. We spend a lot of time now in virtual spaces, many of us communicating by electronic means, and in some cases even projecting ourselves into an avatar, let's say, that meets other people in a virtual space. These are new configurations of social space, just like giant cities were a new a new kind of social space when they emerged. And understanding how those different kinds of space and places where we live affects our psychology, again, for better or for worse, is very important for questions in cultural psychology and cultural psychiatry. And I've already mentioned this issue of the politics of diversity, which I think is terribly important, and it lends an additional ethical and human rights dimension to all of the work that we do, even when we're focused on a more practical question like how to make sense of the suffering of a person who's meeting us in a clinic and talking a different language or using different expressions to convey their suffering. That very practical question is embedded in a larger question that I've already alluded to about how do we live together? How do we live in society with high levels of diversity, with different ways of looking at the world, sometimes with conflicting value systems? How are we going to negotiate this? So what's at stake here is not only a central question in the delivery of healthcare and other services to people in ways that are useful to them, but really some of the most fundamental questions that pertain to survival in contemporary society. We want to make use then, if we acknowledge this question of diversity is terribly important in many ways, and we want to make sense of it, we need methods to be able to study diversity. And part of that then comes from being able to do comparisons, to not just take for granted the norms and the models we have and impose them on other people, which is, of course, a big part of the history of colonialism that has shaped our planet, but to be able to enter into a kind of back and forth exchange of perspectives that decenters us, that forces us to think differently about how we live, and that begins to allow us to imagine the way that other people live and what that means for them, what that connects them to, how that functions in their everyday life, how that functions in the privacy of their thoughts and feelings, how that functions in their families and in their neighborhoods and so on. So to do this, we need systematic methods of comparison, and psychology has a great array of tools available to try to do that in rigorous fashion quantitatively. But prior to quantitative work, in many cases, we need to begin with more qualitative work. Because the tools that we inherit, the quantitative measurements, the various kinds of scales and tests that we have, were generally devised in one or a few particular settings. And so they already put a kind of limit or boundary around what we're asking about, what we're paying attention to. So to get outside the boundaries of our kind of categories, we have to be able to open our eyes, open our minds, and engage in dialogue with people to really get different perspectives. So one way that we can do that is through qualitative research, experience near qualitative research, in which we listen closely to people and try to absorb the story of their lives or their predicament or their situation, and ask questions about things that don't make sense to us. You know, to have enough of a trusting and mutually respectful relationship to be able to say, oh, I didn't know that a family could, be organized that way, or I don't know what you mean by honor. Could you explain to me what you mean by honor and by loss of honor, or what you mean by shame and in this situation, or what you mean by fear? So even words that seem simple in some cases, although they're never simple when you try to translate them into another language, but even words that might be part of our everyday vocabulary need to be explored in a more systematic and grounded way to understand what local world, what particular histories and trajectories of experience are referenced in that language. And when we do that in an open-ended qualitative way, we begin to discover new terms, new concepts, and those can be built into quantitative measures eventually, so that we end up not simply looking through a keyhole at people's experience, but can take in a bigger stretch of it and discover in the process which elements are most important for people. So all that I've been talking about now relates to the dilemma in terms of psychiatry and psychology and our clinical psychology and our diagnostic labeling of what the psychiatrist anthropologist Arthur Kleinman has called the category fallacy. And in an early paper he wrote, based on his work in Taiwan and later his work in mainland China, Kleinman pointed out that we can impose a category like depression major depressive disorder as it exists in ICD or the DSM. And we can go around and count up symptoms in people and find people who fit that, but we really don't know how well that category is actually working in the new context until we explore whether it actually correlates with the things that matter, whether it correlates with distress and disability and trouble functioning, whether it responds to the same kinds of treatments, and so on. Moreover, we might be leaving out things that because we're just not asking the right questions. So that's what Kleiman called the category fallacy, that if we operate just within our existing categories, we can reproduce them. We can find something that matches them, but we don't know how well we're actually doing. So we have to take a step back again, as I said, and begin to ask questions about our categories. We have a good psychometric tool for doing that now in symptom network theory, where we can actually say, let's make a long list of different kinds of symptoms that are local, that use local language, that use particular idioms of distress, and we can see how they correlate. Without imposing a diagnostic category, we can ask which ones hang together, and in that way begin to construct patterns of distress that are useful. So this is one kind of strategy for beginning to make sense of these things. Now, the whole movement and interest in indigenous psychologies has really offered a systematic set of questions and concerns that can allow us to greatly deepen this engagement with cultural diversity, because it's committed in some sense to decentering the whole psychological enterprise and asking whether the categories that we've received from academic psychology, which was largely developed in Northern Europe and North America in the last 100 years, how can those categories and those constructs be supplemented and complemented and transformed with a different vocabulary, with different constructs that may be much more closely aligned with the ways that people are living their lives in particular places? Now, I want to suggest that we think of this term indigenous and how it's being used, because there's several different ways that the term is used, and I'm going to touch on a couple of them. So the most general term and sort of the dictionary definition is simply locally developed and characteristic of a specific place, time, or community. So things that are indigenous are things that belong to that place. And in that sense, you'd have to say, well, all psychology is indigenous psychology. Anthony Marcel has made this argument that the psychology that we call academic psychology or international psychology really at least began as an indigenous psychology, and whether it was in Germany or in the UK or in the United States and so on, it has been generalized, it has been taken up by other people and tested, and so it has a degree of generality, but it still retains many traces of its indigenous roots, if you will, and things that sometimes when they're looked at more closely seem a bit peculiar or don't fit very well. I'll come back to what some of those are. The second meaning of an indigenous, and it's particularly relevant then to this society and to the broader movement of indigenous psychology, is to say, what does it mean for something to be rooted in particular cultural values, worldviews, and perspectives? And how can we use that groundedness to challenge the dominant frame? So in this context, indigenous is sometimes portrayed as in contrast to Western or academic or cosmopolitan approaches, which are treated as though they're universal. And so indigenous is a contrast to this maybe not totally justified claim of universality that is coming from academic psychology. So we have a tension between, academic or cosmopolitan psychology and indigenous psychologies. The third use of this term indigenous is more geopolitical, and it has to do with indigenous peoples. That is, peoples who identify themselves as the original people of a place, who are connected to that place in some ways, and who therefore have certain claims to recognition and to having their perspectives taken into account. This is a complicated political issue, and I'm going to come back to this after talking more generally about the ways in which the second meaning of indigeneity as rooted in particular cultural traditions and values and perspectives can reshape our approach to psychology. So part of the reason why we have a international psychology that has lots of textbooks written in English is because of a history of colonialism. And one of the things that that does is our sort of default mode of framing things is often to borrow an English vocabulary or to have translations of English words. The word stress, for example, spread all over the world very quickly, and people use it pretty much as such everywhere in the world because it taps into something that people can relate to. But that obscures the fact that even when we use a borrowed word, we use it with different nuances. We use it with different connotations because we're living in a different environment where we have different everyday issues we have to address. And so even if a word starts off being borrowed from somewhere, it's going to gradually get its own slant, its own spin that fits with the local context. This is a fascinating book by a linguist, Anne Wiersbeke, who actually based in Australia, who has written at length about how much English concepts and English vocabulary dominate things like our assumptions of what basic emotions are. And so on, all of which is, definitely debatable. So we want to move beyond that. We want to take advantage of the great diversities of languages that exist around the world, each of which represents a different way of looking at the world and to some degree, a different way of living in the world, different practices, different institutions. One way that psychiatry has tried to engage this, and anthropology, borrowing from anthropology, is through the idea of cultural idioms of distress. So this is a concept that borrows from linguistics. We know in linguistics, languages have idioms, that is to say, they have their own special local ways of saying things. And if you're just beginning to learn a language, you might not know those, but after a while you learn these expressions and what they mean, and a native speaker can use these very freely. A person who's not a native speaker may very well misunderstand them and take them too literally, for example, not understand that it's just an expression and it means many different things. So there's a close analogy to this idea of a cultural idiom of distress, which can be language, but it could also be behavior. It could be something that somebody does that serves to communicate distress in a way that people locally understand. Mark Nectar, the anthropologist who introduced this idea, who is studying women in South India, used the examples of a woman complaining of feeling dizzy, but also of a woman burning the dinner as a way of conveying to her husband that she was angry. So this is a readily understood expression of dissatisfaction in the relationship. And because it's understood and because it's sort of ordinary, it doesn't carry any particular stigma. It's a way to communicate effectively without implying, oh, you have a mental health problem or you have some other kind of issue. So this has become an interesting concept to try to introduce into mental health, because when we meet people who speak a different language, or even when they speak the same language that we do, but they use it in a different way, they may be using idioms that come out of their background that we misunderstand, and we have to be alert to those and be able to make sense of those. This has been taken up in a lot of international work in global mental health, but there are some challenges with how it gets taken up, because there's a tendency, as this paper argues, to take an idiom and map it immediately onto a particular psychiatric disorder. But that's not really what this idea of idiom is about. Idioms are supposed to be, cultural idioms of distress are everyday ways of talking about distress. When my grandmother used to complain about her nerves bothering her, she didn't literally mean the nerves in her body, and she didn't necessarily mean that she was depressed or anxious or anything in particular. It depended on the day and on the situation and so on that she was talking about, because that's just a very ordinary, acceptable way for a person of her background and her place in time to be talking about things that are troubling her. So we often have this situation in the clinic where people come and they're talking about things and they're referencing bodily symptoms or they're using other expressions, and we need to be alert to the meaning of that to unpack that. And the way we're going to get at that initially is not by questionnaires, because you can go around and count everybody who's reporting nerves or burning in the chest, or in this case, bakspot. Broken courage, which was presented as an idiom in the Cambodian context for people to talk about how they were affected by the terrible traumas and violence that they experienced. So the general point I want to make again is that making sense of how people talk about suffering is not simply a matter of translating it into a psychiatric category or a psychological construct. It's first and foremost understanding how they're using the language, what it means practically in their social world. And from that, we can work eventually to saying, okay, this is a common language people use to talk about a certain range of problems. Although, as I say, it will probably never be that there's a one-to-one mapping onto things. So this is the simplest level, I guess, of paying attention to culture, noticing linguistic differences and differences in meaning. There are much deeper levels, and this slide is meant to remind us of some of those, and also to push back against a strong tendency we have in cross-cultural comparison is to make binary or dichotomous comparisons. So you probably know a huge amount of the literature in cultural psychology is a kind of East-West comparison. Let's take a bunch of people in the United States and a bunch of people in Japan, and we'll call them East and West, or West and East, and then we'll describe differences. No doubt, as I said, the comparative method can reveal interesting things, but there are a couple of problems with that approach. One is that the world is not divided in two halves, you know, like an orange that we've cut in half down the middle. The world is this hugely variegated mosaic of many, many different traditions that are interpenetrating, that are influencing each other over long periods of time. So we need a much better way of characterizing diversity than simply, you know, East and West or North and South or something like that. The second problem is back to the colonial story, which is that this whole dichotomy began as something that Westerners were observing and sort of constructing or painting a portrait of Easterners based on their own reflections. So to some degree, it's a projection of what Westerners are preoccupied with, of what they notice, of what they're intrigued by or troubled by or fascinated by. Onto Easterners. And it doesn't get any better if Easterners turn around and just write about Westerners, although it's a good first step in getting us away from this simple dichotomy. So what this slide is meant to do is to remind us that that East-West difference, which you can see represented to some degree in the first two rows of this table, where I'm comparing egocentric and sociocentric, or individualistic and collectivist orientations. Again, these will be, or independent, interdependent. These will be familiar terms from cross-cultural psychology. And as I say, a lot of the comparative literature is written in terms of those experiments and studies that make that contrast. But there are just a couple of other rows here that, to suggest that there are many other ways that people configure the sense of self. So I have a row here that represents an ecocentric view. And this is a very important perspective among many indigenous peoples, as we'll come to say more about in a moment. And there's also what I've called, for want of a better term here, cosmocentric. That is to say, people who understand themselves and what it is to be a person in relationship to a larger cosmic order, spiritual order, transcendental order, non-human order. That could be ancestors, could be spirits, could be God, another dimension to existence or another aspect of existence that is not front and center in typical psychology. Now, these four rows are not meant to be a complete list of all the different forms of personhood that exist around the world. It's mainly to just break down this simple dichotomy and say there's a lot more going on. It's also perhaps to make the point, when you look at this, that most of us can relate to all of these to some degree. We might be centered mainly, in my case, very much in an individualistic, egocentric society, where when somebody asks me who I am, my immediate answer is to tell them my CV. You know, I'm Professor so-and-so, I do this, I do that. It's like a list of personal accomplishments, because that's who you are. Most people in the world, when you ask them who they are, answer along the lines of the second row there. They'll say, oh, I'm the son of so-and-so, and I'm from this village, and my uncle is such and such, and so they'll give you the family network or the community that they're embedded in. That's the more collectivist way of construing identity. Maori people, when they meet in a formal setting like in a marae, will identify themselves in terms of the mountain and the river that they're connected to. So that's a more ecocentric notion of the self. And that relationship to the mountain and the river is not a property owning relationship, it's a filial relationship. It's an emotional relationship. It involves sense of duty and a sense of care and so on. And finally, many people coming from a more, again, I'm calling it cosmocentric. I don't think this is a great term, but anyway, let's just use as a placeholder for the moment, will identify themselves in terms of those larger spiritual frames. Now you can see that these different notions of the person, what it is to be a person and how you would describe a person, are associated with different values in terms of what is it that's really important in life, with different definitions of what is it to be really healthy and what is it to live a good life. And you can see that there are differences, and these correspond to differences in the kinds of problems people have and that they're worried about and the kinds of solutions that they expect. Just to show you how this plays out in some ways, and in particular how these notions of concepts of personhood are connected even more deeply to ontologies, I'll just reference this bit of work. I think my colleague Boonwee Lee is on this meeting, attending this meeting with us, so he can speak. There he is. Hello, Boonwee. So he can speak directly to this research which he did, this is a study of a healing practice in contemporary Singapore by Dang Ki, by Hokkien healers and helpers. And the important point for my purposes right now, the way that I'm using this, is that this connects to a particular ontology, a notion that there are gods, there are deities that can come to occupy a person and can work through that person to be helpful to human beings. So that's a particular view of the world, and it leads to certain social practices that coexist with other things, that coexist with people, spending time worrying about how to honor their family and live a good life, or how to get ahead in their career, and all these other aspects of personhood that are at play for all of us. But the balance differs, and the kinds of personhood we can live out depend to some degree on the form of life, the way our communities organize, the social roles we have, but also on these ontologies, the kinds of beings, the ways of being, the kinds of agency that we think exist in the world and in our communities. So here's another example from a colleague, Carla Jessen Williamson, who is an anthropologist, I should say, who is Inuk. She's from Greenland, and she references, I think I have a picture that goes with this. Yeah, so here's the picture that's too small though. Why, wait a second. Oh, I don't know why it ended up so small. Okay, sorry about that. This is because I dragged the slide in at the last minute, I think. So, but basically, if you can see it here, that this is a wall hanging like made with tie-dye made by an Inuit artist. And at the top is the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights. And then there's a couple of polar bears walking on ice floes. And then there's a narwhal. And then at the very bottom, and you're not going to be able to see it here at all, but I don't know if you can see my little cursor. In the bottom left, there are two tiny, tiny figures. And those are two people in a kayak. And this is the Inuit cosmology that puts human beings very off center in a very small way, very different than the famous Leonardo da Vinci painting of Vitruvian Man, where it's like this human being like within a square and a circle taking up all of space. That's the sort of a valorization of the individual. And this Inuit notion of human beings is really a small part of the cosmos. And the way Carla Williamson explains this is that this is the Inuit concept of the human place in the world, because Sila, which is all around us, is the air, weather, intellect, knowledge, integratedness, wisdom, and the external. So this is a dramatically different cosmology than we have in the West in general, both in the secular West, but I would say even in Christian and other Abrahamic traditions, where the idea that what we attribute to human beings, intellect, let's say, or wisdom as quintessentially human characteristics, is actually connected to the environment, and it's actually much larger out there in the world than it is in us. So this is a very different cosmology that shapes how we might think about questions of mental health and well-being, or questions of wisdom, as Igor Grossman studies, and so on. So I've tried to introduce these couple of ideas here just to say that cultural differences go beyond language and the challenge of translating accurately between very different vocabularies that people have, to actually affect how people conceive of what it is to be a person, and what they think goes into being a person, and therefore what they think that goes into being a good person or a well-functioning person. And similarly, the cultures differ in what they think the world is made up of, and what role non-human beings and invisible presences and other kinds of agency might play in everyday functioning. These are not incidental. These are not added things, little apostrophes to our framing of human experience, but can be quite central to how people understand, especially how they understand affliction, forms of suffering, and appropriate forms of healing. So that brings us to the question then I've already touched on briefly of the sort of methodological challenges of trying to study this. And we have efforts now to develop indigenous research methodologies. I've already pointed to the importance of qualitative methods as an essential complement to our quantitative approaches. All methods have limitations and benefits, and we need a kind of schedule of methodological virtues in which we can compare what we gain from one method or another, so we know when and how to use them. Quantitative methods allow us a degree of precision and a degree of generalizability, and allow us to see through quantitative methods hidden relationships between variables that might not be visible in our limited experience of any one individual. But we have major questions of validity when we use quantitative measures, because we're assuming that the way we put a question or the way we're measuring something is transparent, is reliable, is not going to be taken differently by different people. And of course, it often is, particularly across cultures. Qualitative methods are very well suited to getting the density, the thickness of experience, beginning to explore the connections in individuals and so on. And so, as I've already suggested, there needs to be a back and forth. But the idea of indigenous research methodologies goes beyond an obvious role for qualitative methods to hear the voice of indigenous perspectives, to actually raise questions about how it is that we know things and what are the sources of knowledge and what counts as authoritative knowledge. So there are a whole series of issues here that have been raised about the ways in which diverse perspectives of indigenous people have been left out of the conversation, have been disqualified. This is the whole question of epistemic justice, situations in which people are told, we don't need to know what you think, we don't care what you think, we already know what's going on, just fill out our questionnaire, or just, let us approach this in the framework we already have. So when you look at the various arguments, and I've cited at the bottom here some important and influential books that have tried to argue for the idea of indigenous methodologies as an ethical and political and ultimately epistemological approach to getting better knowledge of what's going on, and also to redressing past historical wrongs of epistemic injustice, of silencing of indigenous peoples. When you look at what people are suggesting, there are notions of different methods that include storytelling, ceremony, that is to say, systematic ways of organizing social interaction. For example, I come from a family where the style of conversation around the dinner table is that everybody talks at the same time, and whoever talks the loudest and the fastest gets the most words and gets the most space. My wife comes from a different tradition, both a family culture and a larger culture, in which you say something and then you pause. And when people notice that you pause, they say something in turn. In some of the indigenous settings that I work, one of the protocols, one of the ceremonies for talking together is a talking circle, where people sit in a circle and the first person speaks, and they speak for as long as they want. And that could be 2 minutes, it could be 20 minutes, it could be longer, and everyone sits and listens respectfully. And then what happens is not what would happen in my family, where the person who's most agitated at that point, because they have lots of things to say, bursts out and says something. It's usually me, I should say, but anyway. But what happens in the indigenous talking circle is the next person sitting next to that person is their turn to talk. And so it goes around the circle, each person taking turns. Sometimes there's a talking stick that they pass people. But this ceremonial protocol of just this etiquette, if you will, of giving each person a turn and having their say and moving to the next person, so what the next person says may or may not be closely related to what the previous person says, totally changes the evolution of thinking and process in that group. I've seen this happen with like bureaucrats in the government, where they're ready to do a flip chart and bullet points and get it all sorted out with a managerial approach. And then an Indigenous elder says, no, I think we should sit in a circle and do a talking circle, and each person should only speak from the heart. You can imagine how profound, if people take that seriously, how profound that is as a transformation. So that's what I mean, a simple way, not an elaborate way here, of what could be included under the notion of ceremony as a way of beginning to explore meaning and knowledge that would involve a very different process and that might yield different understandings. I've mentioned land-based activities. We'll come back to that. For many Indigenous peoples, connection to the land and to non-human beings in the land, to place, is very essential. And certain knowledge or certain understandings are only accessed or only present in that relationship. Now, these approaches that are understood as particularly Indigenous in different traditions are consistent, or at least a way to introduce them can be through the framework of something like community-based participatory research, which begins with the ethical and pragmatic assumption that the perspectives and voices of the community are essential. First of all, even to decide what is the goal of a study, what is really the goal of the project, but then to govern very much the process of knowledge exploration and research. This requires a shift in stance, a shift in attitude away from a colonial attitude that those of us who represent or who trained in the global north or the global west have the best available, most sophisticated scientific methodologies, and we should get to dictate the terms, toward other kinds of ethical frameworks of encounter and of dialogue. And I mentioned several of them here. Cultural safety is a notion that comes out of the perspective of Maori healthcare workers, Maori nurse Irapeti Ramsden and others, arguing that in the context of the history of in settler societies, with a history of colonialism, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous voices are generally subjugated, and people are not, it's not safe for people to speak their mind, to speak up in many institutional settings. So this has a broader applicability. We can think about cultural safety in many ways. In Canada, we've tried to apply this also to thinking about migrants and newcomers and whether they feel it's safe for them to speak up their perspective. You know, if you're a refugee or if you're a guest worker or you're someone else with precarious status, you may not feel like it's very safe for you to voice a concern or a complaint or even just a different perspective on things, because you're trying to fit in and, you know, not get in trouble and so on. So that's a broad idea of cultural safety that we need to think about. These two other ideas I think are quite interesting. They come from Indigenous scholars. Willie Ermine, a Cree scholar, has talked about what he calls ethical space. Can we create a third space between the perspectives of the settler, let's say, and the Indigenous person, or the dominant and the subdominant group, the majority and the minority group, however this encounter is framed, where there's inequality? Can we in fact create a level playing field where we say, here's a third space where all that we're bringing has to be treated respectfully, and we can then have a dialogue and we can find new ideas, we can find bridging ideas, and so on. And the final thing here is this, and this little logo or icon goes with this idea. The Mi'kmaq scholar Albert Marshall has talked about what he calls two-eyed seeing, to see with one's, in his case, with one's Western eye and one's Indigenous eye. And he likes to say, you know, if you have one eye, you have monocular vision. If you have two eyes, you have stereoscopic vision, and you actually can see depth. So that's kind of a nice metaphor for the idea that there might be a lot to gain in being able to use these multiple perspectives. And one of the other reasons that this acknowledging these different ways of knowing is important, and it's important ethically and politically, is because there are communities, maybe all communities to some degree, but particularly many Indigenous communities, that constitute themselves as epistemic communities. That is to say, part of what makes them a community is they have revered sources of knowledge and truth. And though recognizing and respecting those voices and those perspectives is fundamental to people's identity and to their community. You can recognize this right away, I'm sure, in the religious context, that there are people who have religious knowledge and traditions, and they view that as pretty fundamental to how they understand the world, and they would want that to be respected in any dialogue between different perspectives. So it's obvious when you talk about the major traditions in the world that have, you know, a big footprint. It's less obvious when you talk about colonized people or or tribal societies or other situations where people have kind of had their traditions ignored or suppressed. So this is, again, raises this question of understanding epistemic communities and how they function, and using something like cultural safety, that is systematic attention to the history of silencing, the history of oppression, the history of ignoring people's systematic attention to that, to deliberately create a space, create opportunities where it is safe for people to talk about their different perspective, to introduce their different ideas. Now in Canada, as I mentioned, 5% of Canadians identify as having Indigenous heritage, there has been a recognition in recent years in Canada that Canada was engaged for 200 years in a process of cultural genocide, of deliberately trying to destroy those Indigenous cultures. So as I mentioned, we're now in a period of a reconciliation process of trying to acknowledge that history and do something about it, so that the lives of Indigenous people and their children and our whole society will be on a better ethical footing. One small way in which that's happened is within the research domain. Canada created an Institute for Aboriginal People's Health, now Institute for Indigenous People's Health. The terminology has changed over the years, so now we use the term Indigenous. These are old documents I'm showing you. But these are produced by that institute, Health Research Institute, focused on the needs of Indigenous people. And these are guidelines for how to do research in Indigenous communities that include examples of contracts and agreements and ethical protocols that will respect the autonomy of Indigenous peoples. And the one on the right is written in Inuktitut, in the language of the Inuit in the Arctic. Another effort in Canada to develop an approach to this is called OCAP, which refers to ownership, control, access, and possession, which the idea being that Indigenous peoples who are involved in research should retain control over the products of that research. Too often research in Indigenous communities has been a kind of extractive process in which researchers go in, do their study, go home, write their master's or their PhD or publish their book, and the Indigenous community never benefits in any way from it. And so this is viewed as almost kind of neo-colonialism, even if it's on a small scale, and it's particularly egregious because this is about cultural knowledge that is central to people's identities and their contribution to the larger human family. So this is an effort to outline these principles that, and this is the same kind of diagram that goes with the same documentation, that shows how the actual process, the agreement that's made between researchers and communities they're working with and so on, could take these things into account. Now, I'm describing a little bit of what's gone on in Canada. I'll say more about that in a moment. But because I think it has lessons for us in other settings, and I'll say more about how that might or might not fit other settings. And I've been talking about research, but the same things that we're talking about, cultural safety and these perspectives of having a true safe space where you can have a dialogue, apply to mental health services as well, in terms of how are we interacting with people? What kind of a face do we present to people when they come for help? What is the institution? How does the institution relate to the community that it's trying to serve? And what process do we go through? So there's been a lot of effort to try to develop that. And it continues to be a dilemma. This is a recent paper we wrote about some situations in Canada where fairly recent, and where Indigenous people felt they were being treated with racism and disrespect, and where the court found in favor of giving Indigenous people more control over their own healthcare. In this case, in the case of two young girls. But it raises many complex ethical issues, which this paper tries to talk about. So let me, in the remaining little bit of time I have, let me turn to saying a few words about specifically, I've already been sort of moving toward that, specifically Indigenous, the context of Indigenous peoples, and to say a bit about that on a global scale, and then end with a few words about the Canadian context, and then hopefully we can go back over these things in the discussion. So first of all, to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples, in some sense, exist all around the world. There are substantial numbers of people, but importantly, 70% of the Indigenous peoples in the world live in Asia. And in fact, and here's just some listings, this is not complete at all, but of different Indigenous groups and communities. And of course, the word Indigenous means something a little bit different because of the history. It means something a little bit different in North America and South America, where that have experienced profound colonization by Northern Europeans and Spanish and Portuguese and Africa or Asia. And I have another map. I don't know if I have it here. And I have another map because Australia is described here as Aborigine, but of course there are many, many different Aboriginal communities. So this is one of the things that tends to happen that we talk about in Canada, talk about First Nations. There are many different First Nations. There's 650 different First Nations in Canada, 11 different languages that are more different, some of them, than English and Chinese. So, we need to recognize that that there is that great diversity even within regions. But the point I just made that 70% are in Asia is also apparent here. You can see the two largest the places with the largest numbers of indigenous people are China and South Asia. And I guess Southeast Asia is also there near the top. So this is interesting for me because in Canada, we talk about Indigenous people, we mean a very particular kind of historical context. The context looks a bit different when you go to China. The people that, for example, the Yi people that Rachel Ting has worked with, or other groups. What is common across these very different settings, though, is huge disparities in the health of Indigenous people and the larger population. And often this reflects either a history of colonization or of internal colonialism in which there's been a dominant group that has marginalized and suppressed minority groups and has led to large historical differences in health that continue up to the present. It's also associated with the way the global economy works. So Indigenous people typically are located in regions that where there are lots of natural resources, that mining companies and other companies are eager to, forestry companies and so on, are eager to get hold of. And so there are frequent conflicts and frequent stories of exploitation of small-scale remote societies by these economic interests. The whole history of colonization in the Americas was justified and led to a bunch of racist tropes and images of Indigenous people as primitive, as backward, as less than human. And we still find this kind of rhetoric and racism to the present, and it exerts profound effects on people's sense of worth and well-being, important psychological damage that continues to be done by this language, which was used to justify really the appropriation of lands, the treatment of lands as there being nobody there and one could simply take the land and push away or decimate the people who live there. So that's an awful history. And as I say, it's had this impact. So we started a network for research in Canada around these issues. And there's a book that we've talked about. And this is just, I'm going to say just a few words about the Canadian context for your own interest in, because it's the one that I'm most knowledgeable about. And it can serve to illustrate the general point that I'm trying to make. These are the language reasons, the major language regions. There are many dialects and so on within these regions of the Indigenous peoples in Canada. They actually correspond largely to ecological regions. That is to say, people living in one of these sort of broad swaths of color are living in an environment that's somewhat similar ecologically, so they have developed cultural approaches like being hunters or fishers or agricultural peoples based on that. Across the board, though, to this day, there are huge disparities in mental health for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And in fact, the Inuit in the north with whom I worked have, Inuit youth have one of the highest suicide rates in the world. So trying to make sense of this requires thinking about not just about their culture, but about the encounter of cultures, about the colonial encounter and about the violence of that encounter, which continues up to the present. And here are some of the forces that affect the mental health of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I mentioned colonization, a process of forced assimilation. People were told, your culture is backward, we need to educate you so you'll be good Europeans or Euro-Canadians. So over 150 years, 100,000, more than 100,000 children were taken to residential schools. These little dots represent the residential schools all across Canada, taken at the age of 5 from their families, sent to these schools, to be trained in, sewing and cooking for girls and woodworking and farming for boys, with the idea, and forbidden to speak their language, forbidden to learn their traditions, forbidden to practice their spirituality, and so on. So this is a massive human rights violation. This is what, as I said, the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada in 2015 concluded that Canada had committed cultural genocide. And I should say culture is not the only country that's done this. There are countries doing this at this moment as we speak. So this is a common and sad story in human history, deeply misguided. Misguided, I'm sure you all understand, because culture is not an either or. You could easily have had a situation where you encourage people to learn lots about their culture and to celebrate it, and they also learned another language and they learned another culture and they participate in that. And we have lots of evidence from work on acculturation that actually leads to better mental health than forcing people to give up what's closest to them. Well, we've had a process in Canada of trying to come to terms with this, and there's been an effort to think through what has been the effect of this 150 years of policy of suppressing culture, which wasn't just the residential schools and included other things. And people have tried to draw an analogy to this, to the Holocaust, to what happened to the Jews and other peoples during the Second World War. The part of the point, I think, is to sort of draw attention to the seriousness and the urgency and the moral gravity of the situation. But it's important for people to have a story of where they come from and what violence has occurred. This is part of cultural safety, people knowing what the past injustices are and acknowledging them and not mistaking the suffering of an individual, not failing to recognize the larger social origins of the suffering of an individual. But of course, there are other things going on than just that history. There's a disruption of transmission of culture across the generations, and there are ongoing dilemmas in terms of how people are acknowledged or respected in the larger society. So if we ask what are the sources of current disparities in mental health for Indigenous peoples, certainly it's this intergenerational trauma and loss related to forced assimilation. There are other things. People were hospitalized for tuberculosis away from their family for many years. There has been a general, I've already described the kind of racism and denigration attached to Indigenous cultures, treating people as primitive and so on. There has been marginalization and lack of people's ability to retain their land and economically benefit from their land, and so on and so forth. So we need to make sense of that. We also need to make sense of how people can respond to that with resilience. And in looking at that, we've had a project, let me skip to that and I'll come back this way. We've had a project to look at Indigenous resilience and to ask people in Indigenous communities, what helps you to do well despite all the adversity that your people have experienced? And when we do that, what we find, these are the communities we worked in Canada, and very different First Nations in different regions. And when we did that, these are the kinds of things that people brought forward as distinctive sources of resilience. Now, this is in addition to the usual sources you would get if you ask people in other places, people who are very clever and smart, who learn well, people who are very agreeable and get along well with others. People who are very attractive in different ways, whatever the local standards are. These are universal, they all have their own local version, but these are common sources of individual resilience. But we were looking for what's distinctive in this Indigenous context, and these are four of the things that came up in different communities. Connection to land and place as ways of constituting and regulating an ecocentric self. So I'm going to go back to that slide I was about to show you. So the ecocentric self that I've spoken about earlier is this notion that what a human being is a being who's in relationship to the land and in relationship to non-human beings. And maintaining those relationships is essential to my well-being. That's how one feels healthy. This is one of the groups that we work with, the Cree in Quebec, in this boreal region just below the tree line in boreal region forest, and they're hunters. And what we found in a study, a big survey of about 1,000 people on well-being, was that what correlated with well-being, or in this case actually with less symptoms of depression, was a good relation with the community. So that's our social being, and the number of weeks spent in the bush in the past year. In the bush, meaning that they go out of their community and they're living in tents on the land, kind of like this, and hunting and feasting and spending time together. And that's directly related to well-being. Now, for me as a person living in the city, this would not be the first question I would ask somebody about sources of well-being. But for Cree, this is very central to what it means to be a happy, healthy human being. And it's not simply a vacation. I guess we could ask anybody, have you gone on a vacation someplace nice? This is a way of being, of living everyday life together with people, together with the land, enjoying the harvest of the land. Second thing you see here is the recuperation of tradition, language, spirituality, and healing as personal and collective resources. And this came up for people because of the history I just told you, that these are communities that had their language and had their traditions systematically suppressed because of the feeling, out of a misguided sense of helping them. The notion was, oh, you need to get into the modern world, so why don't you just give up that stuff? Not just why don't you? You will give up that stuff, and here's what you will study. This caused ruptures between children and parents, parents and grandparents, whole communities, and left people with lots of confusion and lots of struggles over their own identity. The third source that was distinctive was a particular attitude towards stories and storytelling. Stories are important for human beings everywhere in the world. We're narrative beings, so we're made up out of stories as much as we're made up out of neurons and other things. But there's a particular set of ideas among Indigenous people about stories, especially sacred stories, which is that they're kind of like living beings that you take into you and they reside within you and they're available to you in the future when you need them. So unlike the sort of Sunday school stories that people sometimes get, here's the story of Joseph and the many-colored coat or something, or, and here's what it means. We'll tell you the story and it's a nice story, and now we'll tell you the one or two moral teachings from it. This approach to stories is much more open-ended and much more organic. It says, look, the story is like a living being. Its meaning will change. You will draw different things from it at different moments in time. This is what people told us about how they viewed those stories. And finally, interestingly, political activism was a source of resilience and well-being, people said, because they're fighting and trying to address these historical injustices. Those people who are able to take action, to be involved in protests, or to be able to in some ways write or speak or teach in ways that push back against this erasure of their cultures, have been able to do better. So I've already mentioned this notion of stories, this particular approach to stories as a source of resilience. And the last thing I'll mention then is what we've done with this work. For many years, we were looking at risk and protective factors for suicide and correlates of resilience and well-being and so on. But the communities kept saying, we need you to do something. People are suffering. We want you to do something with us that will make a difference. So over time, we developed this program called Listening to One Another to Grow Strong, which is a mental health promotion program that builds on local culture, local language, local stories, local ceremonies, to help young people learn more about their background and their traditions by coming to these sessions and playing games and telling stories and listening to elders tell stories and so on, and doing various art activities. And the net effect is that people begin to feel a sense of connection to their own past, to their own history, and can use that as a platform to go forward, not to look backward and sort of go back to old times, but to have a sense of who they are, where they come from, and then to be able to pursue their goals individually or collectively. So I won't say more about this, but you can find all this online. I think I put the URL there. There's the URL on the top right there. It's just McGill/MHP, and you can find more information about this program. Well, I think I've just about used up my time. Let me just end then with this last slide of what are the questions then for Indigenous psychology. And you see that I've worked through these three meanings of indigeneity, just acknowledging that all our knowledge is rooted in a place and we have to ask questions about where it comes from. The second meaning, to say, given all these different perspectives, we have to be honoring and listening to different points of view and different knowledges, both to respond to the needs of particular communities, but also to enlarge our understanding of psychology and our approaches in mental health. And this third view of saying there are also people who lay claim to the term Indigenous peoples, who often have suffered marginalization and oppression, and they need allies, and they need a voice to be able to strengthen their collective identity and find their place among the great diversity of our world. And this can lead us, I hope, to enlarging our understanding of basic psychological processes and what it is to be a human being in ways that are helpful. Perhaps indigenous ideas about understanding the environment as a living thing might help us to come to terms with the big ethical demands that climate change is making on us. I think this can enlarge our notion of mental health problems and solutions in ways, and find ways, for example, of using relationships as one of the most powerful tools we have to try to cause transformation for people. How to negotiate the political meanings of diversity to live together despite our differences and build pluralistic societies. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope I've left a decent amount of time here for questions and discussion.